Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the sixth in a series of interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Arriving at Truth from the Substantia lecture series. This lecture is available in written form in Bodhi Ocean, an ebook that is available on the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can listen to the full recording of many of these lectures on the lectures page. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website or on our YouTube channel. The URL for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com. And on our website, you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. Richard is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and The Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome to the interview Richard Harvey.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.
And with you, in what I believe is our penultimate interview.
The penultimate interview of this...
of the series, and we've been at it for 108 years.
That's right, that's right. I'm going to start the inquiry with you well into the lecture. This lecture titled Arriving at Truth. And you share a beautiful teaching at a point in this lecture, and you say, quote, "In spite of the indoctrination of thousands of years, in each wondrous individual human being there lies a spark. This spark is greater than the spark of decency to do the right thing, to behave in the right way, to be moral or religious or selfless or self-sacrificing, and all the apparent virtues you and I were taught to aspire to. We were taught to aspire to being good, conformist, acceptable, handleable, tame, domesticated, and to forsake our wildness, our impulses, our ability to feel powerfully and express creatively and be individualistic, even anarchic. The spark I am speaking about is the spark of self-referral, of natural, and whole intelligence, heart intelligence, intuition, higher instinctual nature, inner wisdom, authenticity, compassion, and love. End quote. I remember reading this again in preparation for the interview, and it felt like truth to me. I can't explain why. It just feels right. And so my question flowed out of that feeling. And the question is truth something we think, something we feel, or is it something we know?
Is truth something we feel, or is it something we know?
Or is it something we think? Is it something we think, something we feel, or something we know?
I'm bound to sort of split the hair, aren't I? It's let's at least recognize two orders of truth. The first order being the one that's true for me as a single organism, as an individual with a nature. You know, I have a different nature from you, and you know, our friends will have a different nature. We recognize each other from a distance. We have a signature. We have a sense of being, and a lot of that is occluded by conditioning and upbringing and indoctrination, which includes religion as well as education and parental mindset and the society, etc., etc. So when people come to therapy, inevitably, and we won't talk about the others for the moment, when people come to therapy, inevitably, we're involved for some time with taking off these veils, one by one, you know, over and over. Of course, it's not as tidy as one by one, but we're removing these facades in order to come to the truth of the being of that individual person, and that broadly I call the true nature, respectfully and in honor of the major condition of the second stage awakening, which is the unveiling of the true nature. That's an extraordinary liberation in itself. So anybody who's done therapy for an appreciable length of time will know something of the liberating effect of therapy merely psychologically when they, so to speak, climb out of the box. They climb out of the box and they feel expansive, and they feel in touch with their inner being, and they feel the touch of the inner being onto activity and relationships with others and the outward world. Now, you could say that's something you think or feel, but really it's such a whole experience. It's more like higher instinct or intuition, and it's certainly unfamiliar to the indoctrinated person, which is more or less everybody, of course. So that is a liberation, that's a coming out of the prison per se. But there's another truth that most often we're talking about in all these lectures through the years, and that's the one which we tend to designate with the capital T. It's not a relative truth. It's not a truth at all, and it is not personal. It's impersonal, it's spiritual, it's divine, and more or less, although there is a certain intonation about it all, there's a certain connotation about it all, it pertains to reality. And reality, at least in the teachings as we've been sharing them through these lectures, is synonymous with God. Because God has been personified, God has been cast in the image of the human being, shall we say, for in a sense far too long. So it's been rather, our religions have become confused with our families, and our images of divine beings have been confused with certain kinds of organisms, the human body and particularly in the visage and all of this. And God, of course, doesn't have a face. At the same time, God has every face. Mm-hmm. This face is yours, this face is mine, but to define in any way God in some kind of human form is, of course, to marginalize every other arising form that isn't human. And that's, I mean, human beings are extraordinary, self-reflective and potentially self-realizing, which is a wonderful thing. But, you know, trees are wonderful, dogs are wonderful, you know, snakes and stones and grass and so on and so on. So we might just as easily, in fact it's been done, portray God as a stone, as a human visage or anything like this. And the divine, and therefore spiritual preparation in the way we talk about it, is inherent in a model that can't be thought of. This mystery can never be plumbed. It can never be. It's a mystery that's beyond the mind. It's beyond the emotional self, and it's beyond relative time and space and everything that appears in it. At the same time, it envelops all of that and is that. So here's a way of expressing the mystery and paradox and contradiction. So no, that certainly can't be thought or felt.
You come to a point shortly after what we just shared where you begin to speak about the nature of reality itself. And here's what you share. It goes on for a couple of paragraphs, Richard. Quote, "There is no inner and outer in reality. It is merely a product of dualistic thinking. You see day and night, male and female, so there must be inner and outer. The mind will divide even an atom with devastating results, as we know. Why not inner and outer? There must be. But inner and outer of what? What reality is inner and what really is inner and what really outer? Where's the middle, the divide, the separation? Yes, you guessed it. It's our old friend, the ego. I again, and since there is no ego self, you guessed it again, no inner or outer. Being outside is an escape from your inner world. Being inside is an escape from your outer world. Whichever one you lean toward in practice, something is being missed, obviously. True spiritual practice is not closing your eyes and attempting to withdraw from outer reality. True spiritual practice is not being beguiled and fascinated by the outer world and distracted from the inner world. True spiritual practice is being one with reality itself, and reality is not divisible and not two. My question, Richard, is what does this middle, this divide, this balanced state between inner and outer look like?
I think that the problem, if you will, with the question is that we're talking about transcending the opposites. And if you're in the inner experience or the outer experience, and if you then at any point define a third experience in relationship to the two, then the opposites are still in existence, aren't they? So strictly speaking, in the way you're asking the question, the place through the middle would be flickering between inner and outer. It would be bound to be. So you would still be caught in both, just as much as if you were in one or either. Okay? Okay, so it's not a case of the difference being in the journey through the middle. Through the middle is certainly the place to go, but that's the process. So, for example, in this segment of the lecture, I'm not implying, for example, that it isn't useful to meditate, and meditate in the sense that you bear the inner world, tolerate the inner world. That's very important. But as all good monks will tell you, you can meditate many, many, many hours a day, and 20 years later you're still facing your psychology. You're still facing the business of, am I at ease in and with myself, tolerating my personal inner world? I'm not saying that after an appreciable length of time like that, any committed spiritual practitioner won't have certain experiences, but they will also come back to very base experiences that we all have in the first few weeks or months of a meditation practice, which is, I'm thinking all the time. I'm planning and worrying all the time. I'm caught up with, my leg hurts and I want to scratch my nose all the time. All these things, the usual things. And we have this fantasy, I know I did and most of us did in my 20s and 30s, that this serene thing would come about and you wouldn't have an itch on your nose and you wouldn't be worrying about paying the bills or all these sorts of things. But in actual fact, it's not the case. I've talked to enough people who are doing it all the time. Monks do exactly that, because it's very hard to tolerate yourself. So it's very important to go into the inner world and find a way to tolerate it. And it's very important at the right time to see if you've then used the inner practices in order to push away the outer world. If you go far enough with that, and I think we touched on this last time, did we not, that you get into this, you get into chasing the mystical experience. The mystical experience becomes in and of itself this kind of quasi-divine spiritual matter. But I've said this before in the lectures and I'll say it again, spirituality is not an experience. So any spiritual experience you're having, enjoy it and have a good time and move on. Any spiritual experience you're having which isn't very nice, enjoy that too, experience it and move on. It is not the very heaven, that's not the nirvana, that's not the spiritual place. The spiritual place is a experience, there isn't one. Because every experience, by definition, must have an experiencer. There must be three things going on. The cat sat on the mat. So let's push that out altogether. These things don't happen here in this relative world in the sense that things usually happen. If there were anything like a spiritual experience, you wouldn't even be able to record it or make an anecdote of it or even come back and say, hey, this happened. Any of those things that are, hey, this happened, are relative space-time experiences. Let's not knock it. This is the outer world in relationship to the inner world, and this is what by far most people consider to be the totality, but it's not. What's very much the same and analogous to the conscious and unconscious classic diagram, which is the iceberg, where you have 9/10 of it or whatever below the water, and this other little bit that you think is yourself, because it's the only bit that you can see, is this relative world of day and night and good and bad and sun and moon and all of this going on all the time, in which you might say, I can close my eyes and here's one world and I dream, there's a world, and here's this other one where I go to work and I have relationships and I drive a car and all of this. That's all of it. No wonder people get despairing and despondent and depressed because they can't find meaning in either of those two fields. You find true meaning or significance or the divine event, the divine person, out of the dimension of relativity completely. So therefore, when you say, what does it look like going through the middle, the answer is that's the psychospiritual journey. It looks different to everybody. I mean, it's terrifying, it's awe-inspiring, it's full of every feeling and every kind of experience and personal myth possible. It's the whole shooting match. Everything's going to happen going through the middle, but you know you're going in the right direction there. And when you come out, there's nothing I can possibly say or you can say about how it looks or feels or senses in any shape or form, because you're beyond the realm of the senses. You
go on to speak about the malaise in the 21st century about love, wisdom, and truth. And here's what you have to say. quote, "Here in the 21st century, we need to undergo a massive rethink. We must think past our habits, our assumptions, and our expectations. We must ask radical questions. Is it really spiritual practice? Is it really spiritual at all? What is required? What is necessary for our psycho-spiritual unfolding to take place? What is love? What is true wisdom? And what is truth?" And I thought about this quote, and I wanted to ask you, do we need to ask the questions to find the answer? Do we actually need to seek truth to find it?
Well, of course, and I know, and we've already discussed perhaps the end of seeking. So technically speaking, you have to shed even the seeking. That's true. But in terms of asking a question, I would suggest as a working piece of work in progress, let's try and remember that people ask the question in different kinds of ways. The intellectual may well ask the question, or the rationally minded, or the person with mental access may well ask the question quite literally, but so too is the fakir, and the fakir archetype would be expressed in the modern world in hatha yoga, in tai chi, in martial arts, in kinhin, in any spiritual orientated physical work. I've surely left out many there, but any those who have physical access will inevitably be drawn towards some kind of physical regime or practice, and many of those, especially ones coming from the East, have a spiritual aspect to them, and so they'll be drawn in that way. The question will be asked. I see the question then very broadly. It could be asked in the body, it could be asked in the mind, clearly, and it could be asked in emotions. I think if somebody comes to see you or I for therapy, for example, they may be very often are confused about feelings, which is a funny thing to say if you think about it, because confusion comes from the mind, and emotions or feelings don't come from the mind. You don't feel in your mind, you think and you analyze and you reflect and break it down and everything, emotional experience, but you don't actually feel in the mind. So when people say confused in the mind, they're already obviously confused. It's bringing together two streams of experience in a very strange kind of a way. But I think what they're often saying is that I'm asking in my emotional body a question that appears as despair or despondency, or of course in intense sadness or anger or pain or fear, for example. So that's how I see the question. The question has to be asked, but if you're a physical or emotional person in terms of access to the world and you're not overly rational, intellectual, mental, you're still asking it, just asking it in the way that makes sense to you. And I hope that we've made that clear in a way, or implied it, or sometimes brought it forth through the whole series of lectures. That because I remember in the early days, one of the earlier lectures in the seminar that followed, and someone implied that they couldn't do it so well because they weren't so intellectual and scholarly as these things we were talking about. I don't know if you remember that. Someone put that in a question somewhere, and I had to point out that that wasn't an issue in any shape or form. And I mean, my own first spiritual teacher wasn't nowhere near as rational, intellectual, mental as me. He was far more emotionally based, I think. And so you appreciate that in people, and you appreciate their modes of access and how they ask. So there's been plenty of intellectual, mental teachers, perhaps Krishnamurti in the last century, preeminently, an extraordinary mind. for pulling everything apart and saying, well, what do we mean by this? What do we mean by this? But always with this spiritual sensibility and a sense of heart. But his primary access was deftly, very sharply intellectual. And then you can have somebody like Ramakrishna from the previous century, who was heart. He was just heart. And he was full of presence, he was full of feeling, and people were drawn to him for that, or in that way. And there's no gauging of this, there's no saying it should be more this than that. And in our spiritual being, I suggest they will all merge after they've balanced or aligned in many ways. In the meantime, our true nature presides over our expression of the spiritual divine.
As you approach the end of the lecture, you cut to the core of your teaching on arriving at truth when you share the following, quote, "To seek truth, which is a synonymous with God, the divine, great wisdom, enlightenment itself, consciousness, reality, and so forth. To see truth, you must not look anywhere. You must not retreat inward, neither be distracted outward. Both you see are seeking. Both are seeking, and seeking is not being with truth as it is. Truth is here. Truth is now. Truth is eternal. There is nowhere that truth can hide or be concealed. In every small place, big place, everywhere and nowhere, truth is arising, present, and eternal." My question is what role does surrender and acceptance play in the arrival at truth? Or should I say arrival in truth?
The role is surely let's just backtrack slightly. In order to arrive or attain or what do we say? Achieve something in this relative world, it inevitably turns out to be something strategic and active and some forward motion. In order to arrive at having a degree, at having a good job, creating a family, buying a house, whatever it is, buying a book from the bookstore, there's a certain strategy involved. The curious thing about spiritual practice and endeavor, of course, is never the same as anything occurring in your relationship with the outside world. So we have to say these very odd things, like, for example, it's not about doing more or doing new things or techniques or all of that. It's about seeing, first of all, what you're doing. That's acceptance, because you can't see what you're doing unless you're all accepting of it. Some of it's not very nice, after all. Some of it isn't what you would wish for yourself. So acceptance is very important to deepen in awareness and to provoke change by allowing certain habitual reactions and actions that you do, however subtle, not necessarily gross or outward orientated at all, but things you may very inwardly do habitually and familiarly. Let them go, let them go, let them go. When you pick up a book in order to get closer to God, put it down. That's not what it's for. Or if it is what it's for, it's the wrong book. It may be nice to read, but don't think that's what you're doing. You'll get caught in the search, you'll get caught in the identity as a seeker, and that has to go. If you can't stop doing it, apply more acceptance and awareness. And surrender, of course, in the willingness to let go, to let go. So, as has often been said before, therapy, psychospiritual therapy, this psychological preparation for the spiritual is an endless taking away. It's an endless process of loss. There's acceptance and surrender. Acceptance, recognition, willingness to let it go. Surrender, you see. So you keep taking away like a good sculptor until the shape that's inherent in this block before you is standing there true and beautiful and clear, and this is somehow the shape that the block already inherently appealed to your senses for you to reveal. Now whatever's left, even if it's just that, that's all you need, because that you can't take away anymore. That's the core, that's the essence, that's the divine spark, that's the philosopher's stone, it's the holy grail, it's the jewel that's in your own heart. And there's been so many ways of saying this. Why has there been so many ways of saying this? Because it's true. It's getting about as close to truth as we can get in the relative world when we have to express it through poetry, really. We have to say it artistically. We have to say it in some kind of metaphorical way, like a painting. We have to express it. Because it's not really the thing. It's always symbolic. It's symbolic of this otherness, shall we say, of the noumena. So acceptance and surrender, I'm glad you brought them up, are a very good summary of spiritual practice. So there's nothing you ever do for something, which we've all been caught up in, surely, or can all still be caught up in all the time. But spiritual practice, psycho-spiritual practice per se, not necessarily in the beginning preparations, because you may have to do any number of foolish things in order to combat foolishness. But when you're engaged in the thing in and of itself, nothing is done for some extraneous reason, because it will only push whatever it is that you fantasize you're trying to get hold of further away. So this has been said many times, as St. John of the Cross said, it's as if you can feel God's breath on your neck. It's closer to you than your own skin, your own nose. Bearing that in mind, there's nothing that you can do that will draw it closer other than stopping doing everything that you're doing that pushes it further away.
Which may be an answer, if nothing else, a lead-in to the last question I want to explore with you, because this is how you end the lecture. You end it with what I think is the ultimate question of this lecture, and that is, what is the value of truth, and how can we learn to prize it and arrive at truth? I'll repeat that. What is the value of truth, and how can we learn to prize it and arrive at truth? And so how would you, Richard, respond to that question?
I guess I only asked the question, did I? I didn't. It's that sort of lecture, was it? Well, in discussions recently and thinking about it, we seem to have, surely more, but we have certainly two main schools, don't we? Which is the worship for, what would you call it, the distancing school, where people go to God, and after all we're talking truth synonymously with God here, as something that's external, as something to which there is a journey in order to prize it in a worshipful, distancing way. And my, not experience, but my conviction has been always the inner knowledge that God is within everything, not just in us as a child and in us when we grow, but in everything. And I don't mean that in a literal way, it's a metaphor. So in order to prize it, you need to go to your edge. This again has been inherent in many of these lectures, trying to find the edge of fear or horror, or that place where you say, God, 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 not God now, not God. Is some part of you, something that you dub with some kind of negativity, some kind of an evil sense, and you go, God, 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 not God. So in order to prize it, I think you have to find what is divine in the totality. Everything has to be included. I don't think you arrive at truth until you find a way to embrace everything. And the practice, which I always encourage for that, is to find out where your boundary or your line is. You say, well, I cannot accept that. You know, I can't countenance that. I mean, you can say this is God and thank you very much, but this, definitely not. And there's the place for you to grow into, because you have to find God in the most repulsive ugliness in order to really prize the beauty and the light.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Beautiful place to leave our interview for today. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
And as you alluded to at the beginning, when we come together the next time, we'll be discussing the last lecture in this series, Substantia, and the last lecture in the 42. And the last lecture we'll discuss as an interview in this entire lecture series that has been ongoing for between 2 and 3 years now. So I look forward to it. And the title of it is A Spiritual Autobiography.
Fantastic. Until then, thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For now.